Adam, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Perfecto. Very welcome.
Thank you. Well, thanks for, I want to thank the Critic Festival for inviting me to come today. So I'm Adam Dubov, and I'm going to talk about the multi-platform content strategy that we used at HBO, where I used to work, for the show Game of Thrones. And probably an interesting thing I should probably point out is, what does the word multi-platform mean? So that really refers to when you take a TV show or a movie or any kind of production and you extract elements from it and put it onto the web, basically, right? So either extend that experience or give viewers and fans more of the experience of the show that they can enjoy, and it helps build your brand, it helps satisfy the fans of the show, etc. So, let's see. Hola. So background about me. I was basically came from the entertainment industry, so I come from the future by way of the past. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm from Hollywood. My parents were actually in the motion picture and TV business. My mom was a very successful, pioneering female screenwriter who worked from like the days of live radio through television, because radio became television in the 1950s. My dad was an actor and also a writer, and he worked in Hollywood as in what they used to call B movies, film noir, a lot of gangster movies in the 50s and 60s. So I grew up in a family business, which was entertainment. So I went to UCLA Film School, and I got a BA and a master's in motion picture production, and I was making films. I learned basically all of the analog arts, the classic analog arts of how you make movies. So writing, producing, directing, cinematography, shooting, editing, post-production, all of that, and I made films. I also got very interested in the internet when it appeared, and I first saw the Mosaic browser. And this was in the late 1980s, early 90s. And I realized when I saw that, this is going to literally change everything. This is like the Industrial Revolution. This is like the steam engine. This is like electricity. The ability to create interactive content and have it on the web and accessible globally. So I started working in big media companies as a content executive or programming and publishing executive. So I worked with a variety of different companies, starting with AOL, if anybody remembers that. That was the beginning of the internet, really, when people had to use CD-ROM discs to get online to a dial-up modem that they could go to the AOL service and they could send instant messages to each other. They could go in chat rooms, and they had email, which was new. So I'm old. But I was working on content development for the whole AOL ecosystem, and I did that for many years. And I worked at a company called Real Networks that invented the Real Player, which was one of the first streaming video players that was built. And then in 2008, I went to HBO in New York, and I was senior director of HBO.com, which was, of course, HBO's website. I was hired there to basically try to modernize that because they had a very primitive web presence at that time. And we're kind of behind the curve. They were ahead of the curve in making television, but they were behind the curve in their whole digital presence. So I sort of adopted and this ragtag group of web producers and editorial people and graphic designers who were doing basically putting photos up on the web, on HBO.com every day, from basically all the spin-off stuff that advertising was generating. There was no original content being done for the web. And I basically took that as an opportunity to really kind of push the envelope, if you will, and to try to see what we could do with this new medium, right, within the context of HBO, promoting HBO's television. So a little bit about HBO. This is all a tale of digital transformation, which is also digital disruption, right? And that's, I think, why we're all here with Techno Creative Arts Festival. That's one of the accelerating, exciting aspects of digital transformation. The access to all of these tools and technologies to create digital media and to create art and all of that. But it didn't come from a vacuum. And what's interesting about HBO in particular, technical and digital disruption of their business as cable TV ultimately changed the kind of television that they made. And I'll try to explain that in simple terms. Cable TV was invented in the 50s and the 60s to bring TV signal to places where you couldn't get good reception through the air for broadcast. Television, of course, was dominated by the three big broadcast networks in the United States: CBS, NBC, ABC. And then they also had public TV, which was much smaller. So they started wiring up these kind of backwoods places in America with cable, and these companies that were doing this suddenly started creating new markets for television distribution because those new cable systems needed programming. They needed to put something on there that people would watch. And those started to grow and grow and grow. Eventually, some of these cable companies became very huge and very powerful. They also are the internet providers for a lot of the United States. It's probably the same here in Chile. Companies like Comcast. Comcast eventually buys Universal Studios, an old venerable Hollywood studio. It buys NBC. It buys the broadcast network that it had kind of replaced. So basically, all of these networks needed programming. Now, in 1972, HBO was founded by Time Life, the publisher, literally to bring boxing matches to Lower Manhattan. Why would you have to do that with cable? Because the tall buildings disrupted the broadcast signals. And so they basically wired up Lower Manhattan, and they continued on with that. And they basically started just bringing boxing matches to people. Then they got satellite, uplink, and they invented that. And they merged with Warner Communications to become Time Warner. And they started sending the signal out with the boxing matches and also with a movie channel where they were showing movies that they were getting from the studios. And that became the foundation of basically subscription cable. Now, HBO original programming revolutionized television. And what that refers to, and this was an advertising campaign, and it basically became part of HBO's logo shortly before I went to go work there, which was HBO, it's not TV. Or it's not TV, it's HBO. So what do they mean by that? It means that the kind of television that they were making changed. Why was that? The audience was adult. You had to have a credit card, literally, to get a subscription to cable. So they could presume that you were an adult and that you had money. You had some modest affluence. They went and they lobbied Washington very brilliantly to relax the censorship rules that used to apply to all of the broadcast networks that were free to everybody to watch, that were ad-supported. And they basically said, we're not free and open. You subscribe to this. So after like 9 o'clock, can we show some nudity, some bad language? Can we show some adult situations? Can we have gay characters? All of that. And basically they were able to do that. And so they started to change the kind of programming they were making. They also paid less money to the creators than the broadcast networks did. But in exchange for the less money, they gave them more creative freedom. And that is really hugely important. And when they gave them the more creative freedom, they said, you can make more daring, adult, interesting, unexpected, non-copycat kind of TV shows. For a lot of the best, we now call them showrunners in Hollywood at that time, this was like a dream come true. They no longer had to sort of struggle against the restrictions that the old broadcast networks put them on. So HBO, through all these business reasons, ultimately started to usher in a new kind of television. In 1999, The Sopranos. 2002, The Wire. Deadwood was not widely seen. I don't even know if it came down here or not, but 2005. But what was interesting about these shows is that they were made by The Sopranos and The Wire, Sopranos and Deadwood were made by guys who were already working in TV for many, many years in America. David Milch for Deadwood and Chase for The Sopranos, David Chase. But what they did was, and The Wire was, of course, David Simon, and David Simon was a journalist. He had made a whole series of articles about what was really going on in Baltimore, the streets of Baltimore, during the whole crack wars of the 1980s. And basically, they started making these shows. And the interesting thing about them was TV was very formulaic. There was a certain kind of satisfying standardization to the form of television shows. And it's kind of like the predictable nature of why people like McDonald's, so they know what they're going to get, And the shows had certain kind of act breaks and character arcs, and those were done in broadcast to facilitate the insertion of commercials, obviously, the advertising that paid for the TV shows. In this cable subscription model for adults, that changes. And these showrunners start making shows where, first of all, there are no ads, there are no commercials. The act structure changes. The character arc starts to stretch over episodes. In a traditional TV show, they would make a bunch of episodes. Each episode would be like a situation, a problem, a beginning, middle, end, resolved, done. Next week, you saw the next installment, and that happens again. It happens again. These guys start making shows where the stories are like novels. And the interesting thing is, those character arcs go over multiple episodes, seasons, years. And television, arguably, under this model, becomes narratively more satisfying and superior to feature films made by the big studios. That's kind of an amazing thing. So I went to HBO in 2008. After The Sopranos ended in, I think it was 2006 or 2007, they had put everything into that, and they kind of the cupboard was bare, as they say. They didn't have a lot of new programming. And so they had to work very fast, and they needed to kind of reinvigorate their market with new shows that they hoped would become successful franchises. They made a very, very, very bold bet. They decided they were going to make a franchisable fantasy series like a Lord of the Rings, right? Obviously, it wasn't the Lord of the Rings, and they couldn't get the Lord of the Rings because that was already taken. But they took A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, the series of books that they turned into Game of Thrones. And they liked it because they had an aversion to fantasy as a genre before this. All those other shows are very real and gritty and like urban drama kind of situations. What they liked about A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, as articulated by the showrunners David Benioff and Dan Weiss, who they brought it to HBO and convinced HBO that they could, quote, crack it. They could figure out a way to make it that would be in the HBO manner. What they loved about this was the consequences were brutal and real, right? For all of you who, have watched Game of Thrones or read the books, for the first time, your mind is blown that they build up Ned Stark, right? And he's the hero, and like in a traditional Hollywood movie or a TV show, he would live forever, He would have 100,000 encounters with bad forces, and he would always win, and he would come out basically with the girl and, with money and all of that stuff, and it'd be a happy ending. No, they chop his head off in the first season. It's like, wow. And it's like, that's something that was very kind of HBO to really appeal to their sensibilities, because the consequences were real, though it was a fantasy. And they also really were drawn to the depth of what was possible with this series, with this whole cycle of books. Now, the mandate that we had from our bosses was, in consumer marketing, we have to create HBO's Game of Thrones. So not the books, but HBO's show that's going to come from the first 4 books. And then we're going to continue it on after that. Now, there was a huge built-in audience of people who were obsessed with the books. And they had a huge amount of digital presence, which I became immediately aware of. They had tons of fan art. People were, it wasn't quite at the point where people were getting married as like Game of Thrones characters yet. That came later. But they were, sharing fan art. They were creating their own fan art. They were creating their own maps. The interesting thing is, with the books, we started reading the books because the way that we ran our content operation, we would go deep into all of the programming. And so we would read the scripts pretty much just after the scripts were released to production to shoot. And my team was always reading the scripts, so we were, expert, and we were going to be really in line with the overall marketing of the shows. So you just need to understand that, so the decisions you make are authentic to the material. One thing that I noticed when I started reading the books, in the back of the book, it was like, Jesus, this is really complicated. All of these characters, this mythology that goes back like a couple thousand years in this mythical land of Westeros and Essos. Who are these people? Wait a minute, who was this guy? Who is she? Oh my God, this one just got his head cut off. How does this all work? How do you keep track of it? And the places and the houses and all this. In the backs of the books, George R. Martin had these very primitive line drawings that were family trees. And he had a very simple map that he drew himself that showed where all these places were supposed to be in the story. So I basically thought, okay, how are we going to do this? And this is one of the rare times in like a career when you are working in a company like HBO and you've got your own part of the area that you can make decisions about, but you have a team and you have people working on your team, and there's always a lot of sort of, submitting ideas of what should we do, or how should we do this one, how should we do this one, how should we do this one. This is one of the rare times where I actually thought this up myself and said, no, we're going to do this. I think I know what to do for the content strategy for Game of Thrones. I said, we're going to take those drawings that are in the backs of the books, and we're going to turn it into essentially a content-rich, narratively driven wiki, both with a map and with these family trees, and we're going to build what would then later become known as a second screen experience, which is like an experimental form of what people were also working on at the time and have been working on ever since, interactive television. Because at that time, there was a trend where people were starting to watch TV and text each other with their phones. Or they would watch TV and they would have their iPad out. And they would text with their friends, and they would comment as they were watching, and there was social sort of television viewing starting to happen. And also, people were... Amazon bought IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, and Amazon said, oh, yeah, let's buy that so we can have, like, their X-ray feature where on cable you're watching Amazon Prime. You say, oh, who was that guy in that? Oh, I've seen that guy in that movie. And you get that data right away. Alexa, who's this, who's that? So there was definitely a movement to try to provide deeper experience, contextualized content, background information, all that sort of stuff, while you're watching TV, and that was a way to enhance the experience. So I wanted to do this. And the funny thing is that my team, my editorial guys, who were, I said, okay, I want to basically do what I just described. And they said, no. We don't want to do that. I said, why? It'll kill us. It's too much material. It's too much. I said, no, it's not actually. It's a lot. It seems like it's infinite, but it's not. And they kind of had a little mini rebellion. They didn't want to deal with it. I, one weekend, spent a bunch of time in my office with a paper cutter, and I printed out all of the houses and their heraldry, and I put them up on my bulletin board. And then I put the family trees that came out of George R.R. Martin's books, and I Xeroxed them, and I put them up on my bulletin board. And it said, here's the Starks, here's the Lannisters, here are the Targaryens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on Monday morning, my team came in, and they were like, what's Dubov been doing? They come in, and they look at this, and they're like, wow. And I said, there you go. It's not infinite. It's 9 feet wide on paper and 4 feet deep in paper, but we can actually do this. This is not going to kill us. So that's basically what we set out to do. It was to create what would become a second screen experience for Game of Thrones. So we could play the clip. This is a promo that was made by HBO and was also shown on air for what became known as the HBO.com Viewer's Guide for Game of Thrones.
Explore even more of Game of Thrones with the all-new Viewer's Guide. As you watch, master the houses, navigate through the lands, and get exclusive videos tied to each episode. Available on your computer, iPhone, and iPad at hbo.com/GOT Guide. Experience the ultimate viewing companion and dive deeper into Game of Thrones.
Now, what was interesting, too, was that we started working on this, and then about 1 month before season 1 of Game of Thrones went on air, I was with my wife and our dog, and we were walking the dog in the park in Brooklyn, where we lived at that time, and my phone rings, and it's my boss's boss. It's Courtney Monroe, who is the executive vice president of consumer marketing for HBO. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful woman, and one of the best marketers I think I've ever met, and also a really nice person, but tough. She calls me up and she says, Adam, that thing, listen, Bill Nelson, who was the CEO of HBO at that time, Bill Nelson called me up last night at her house on the weekend and said, we've been looking at the dailies and the first cuts of the first season of Game of Thrones, and this is really complicated. It seems like there's so much going on in these shows. It's like more than we even imagined when we were working on the scripts. And he said, do you think that maybe HBO.com could put together some kind of like guide or something, or some kind of online thing and it's that thing, you were talking about it. Are we doing that? And I said, Courtney, got your back. We are doing it. She said, thank you. Calls Bill Nelson, says, we got it. That was like one of those moments like in a corporation where that normally would have been a disaster had we not already been doing this, because that would be like we suddenly realize they want this and they've left us no time to actually do the work, right? So that was actually kind of fortuitous. But what was this really? Basically, it was an interactive web-based second screen experience. So it's essentially a very fancy website. But what it had, which was pretty cool, was like from building websites for years and years, we had mastered, some of the arts of UX, right? Like how to build websites, how to organize information in websites. And so basically, this is from season 4. So this is where we kind of finally got to the point where this was, first of all, responsive website, meaning it worked beautifully, whether it was on a PC or a Mac or a mobile phone or a tablet. It was a scrolling site, which we now all take for granted, but was new at that time. And so you could scroll through it and scroll through time. What was interesting about it, too, was by the 3rd season, we said, okay, we're going to make this spoiler-free, because the huge thing and the huge problem with Game of Thrones is that, well, all TV shows really, but it was really a problem with Game of Thrones. People don't want, the audience members who don't know what's coming don't want to be spoiled. They don't want the fact that someone's going to lose their head is, they didn't know that. And they're going to be upset when they find out, if they find out before they see the show on Sunday night. So basically, we had a system where like you cookied yourself when you start using the site and you say, okay, I'm starting at this point in the series. And from that point, it wouldn't load more content. You couldn't go forward in time. We would publish the site at 1 minute after it aired on the East Coast. Because in those days, and it's still true today, but in those days, once these episodes air, all hell breaks loose on social media. People go crazy. And then you have people from the books looking for stuff that's different than the books. And then they get into gigantic online conversations. You have people who haven't seen the books. They're doing the same thing. How many people here have actually watched Game of Thrones, the first Game of Thrones? All right, so a lot of you. The Red Wedding, right? That blew people's minds when that happened, and people who didn't know that was coming. So it would usher in all of this social sharing, which was all good news for HBO, and that was like, we were succeeding in marketing the show by doing this sort of very lavish content marketing, right? So it's not just advertising, we're giving you sort of more of the show. This was organized so that you could go through the episodes, and you could also go through these family trees, which we had advanced and advanced and advanced from the versions that, George R. R. Martin had. This one was interesting because this actual image, I got off the web. This came from an article where, at 1 minute after air on the East Coast, we pushed this live, and people saw just this one name, Willa, deceased. And she's probably the mother of Jon Snow, the bastard son of Ned Stark. And it was alluded to in the books, but it was not anything that was, I don't think it was actually in the books, and we put that in there. That one little thing, when this went up within minutes, people were already, oh my God, that's who his mother is. And there was all this social sharing going on about that. So it was really became an engine of the storytelling of the show itself, and it kind of extended that. We also had various iterations and generations of the map. George R. R. Martin had a very primitive map of Westeros and Essos in his books. There was a lot of fan art where people had made their own interpretations of that. Some of it quite elaborate. Some of it was quite nice, and I would like them to come work for me. But the crazy thing about the map was we had to make this map and before season 1, and getting it right is critical. So we want to make sure that we're using like the official vision of the map from HBO. But we very quickly found out no such thing existed. And there were various versions of things. I actually went out to LA, Los Angeles, where the HBO's production programming group is located. And I met with the title house and agency that does a lot of the title sequences for HBO. And I met with their executive creative director. And he showed me the very beginnings of what you see in the title sequence of Game of Thrones, with the title going by and the world is turning and the camera is swooping in and the buildings are starting to come up out of the ground like automata and, machines from the Middle Ages. Except it had none of the detail. It was a white box animatic, as they call it. And everything was just like white blocks. And I said, okay, so where's the map? And he goes, oh, there is no map. I said, I was told you guys had a map. And they said, no, we don't have a map. What we're showing is the land itself, except it's mapped onto the inside of a globe. And there's a astrolabe from the Middle Ages with all of this storytelling information orbiting a sun, and the whole thing is turning around, and we go to each of these cities and destinations as they appear in the story. And I was like, whoa, I don't even get it. I've got a pretty good imagination. I couldn't even understand, and I said, dude, kudos that you sold this in, awesome, but I don't, this looks pretty weird. I don't know how you're going to pull this off. I went back to New York, I showed all the stuff that I got to my senior art director and my graphics guys, and I just said, guys, there is no map. Jake, you're going to have to do the map. Straight, no chaser. Just do it. You're going to have to make all the decisions about what the land looks like, what the water looks like. It's got to be different than the fan maps. It's got to be better than all of them. Just figure it out. And he did. Now, it's like the thing that's amazing is that, in a business like HBO, you have to sell in all these concepts, right? And you have to get approval from the showrunners, who are very powerful and influential. You cannot displease them with anything. It's disastrous. we worked on this map for a couple of months, and we were about a month out from airtime. And I had to go and show it to David Benioff and Dan Weiss, the showrunners, and Caroline Strauss, who's the executive producer, at their offices at the studio in Hollywood. And so I flew out there. I had printed out a giant facsimile of the map, and I carried it out there in a tube, like, architect tube. And we went, and we had a meeting. And this is where, like, my own weird, past of I'm actually a filmmaker, right? Like they are. I'm actually a director and a writer like they are. But I'm working in the capacity of being, an executive in the marketing department of HBO. But I got to sell this into them. So we're having this typical Hollywood studio kind of meeting where it's always really weird. You're always in like really low chairs and couches, and everyone's like sitting like this, and there's a coffee table. And it's always difficult to get up and show anybody anything. And I said, okay, I have the map. And I said, okay, let's see it. I pulled the map out, and I spread it out on the big glass coffee table. And David Benioff and Dan Weiss, Caroline Strauss all looked at the map. And this was the coolest thing. David Benioff kind of just slid out of this low, cushy couch and went on his knees and started crawling up to the table and starts like really looking at it. And he's like going over it, and they're going, oh yeah. And I'm like, oh shit, I hope he likes it. And it's going to be really bad news if he doesn't for us. And he just spends a couple of minutes taking it in. And he just turned around and he just said, thank you. This is great. We love it. I was like, yes. Yes. It was very good in Jake's household that night when I called him and said, we're good to go. Because we did not have time to fix it. But what was cool about the map was that embedded in it was content. Right, so, and this was also episodically, to be spoiler-free, episodically updated every night, every episode night, 1 minute after East Coast air, because it contained new information. And the information would have videos you could play, it would have background information about the place, it would have stuff about the story. And so basically we were using the map not just as a resource to kind of orient you to the geography. We were actually using it as a storytelling tool because there was story embedded in it, and you could use it to tell parts of the story. Now, this was the most techno-creative part of this presentation that I wanted to share with you. So I went back into my archives, and we actually pulled off an audacious kind of thing within HBO marketing at that time. We had to always, before I got there, the digital department, first of all, it wasn't called the digital department, it was HBO.com. It was just the name of the website. But they would just put up whatever the advertising group put out as marketing material. You just slap that on the website. And then when social media came out, they would just share that stuff. We didn't make anything, weren't making anything unique or different. I changed that, and as part of all of that with this, I talked them into, I said, okay, the production design of Game of Thrones is sick. It's like just over the top great because they did it in England and the Brits are the best at this. And I said, I want to go over to where they're shooting Game of Thrones in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in a place called the Harland and Wolff Shipyard, which is where they built the Titanic in 1912. They were shooting it there. They had just wrapped, so it was a warm set. And we got there when they were starting to catalog and pack everything up. They also didn't know Game of Thrones was going to be a hit. And, of course, the showrunners didn't know, and HBO didn't know, would there be a season 2 of Game of Thrones. They didn't know. You know, it's in business, in the entertainment business, it's a crapshoot. You never know. The audience decides whether there's going to be a second season, ultimately. So I said, okay, I want to fly over this digital capture group from HBO.com. I'm going to hire some contractors. We're going to go over there, and we're going to do LiDAR scanning, and we're going to scan all of the props, the helmets, the Iron Throne, all of this stuff, and we're going to create 3D models of this. And we're going to put this on the web, and the fans are going to go crazy. And they somehow allowed us to do this. And so went to Belfast, and I took all of these LiDAR scanners. So the technology was really pretty interesting. You know, we used LiDAR scanners to scan the big items, and we had access, which was crazy, and which is also difficult to get in the entertainment business. You have to have the trust of the producers and the showrunners to be able to do this. They have to trust you because you can't mess any of this up, and if you do, you're fired. So, you know, I kind of, as a former filmmaker, I had their trust. I knew how to handle dealing with them, as did the people that I brought. But I mean, amazing stuff, right? Like, this is the Lord of the Flowers armor and his helmet. And we basically had access to everything that they had. This is the guy who ran the LiDAR scanning crew. His name's David Cullifer. He's has a great background, and he invented a lot of stuff for the automobile industry for making car commercials with digital models of cars. He kind of looks like he could be in Game of Thrones, too. He's a big, you know, heavy metal dude from L.A., but, you know, so we have, like, you know, the Hound's helmet. And then we were also shooting high-resolution photographs, and we were also doing high-resolution photogrammetry. So we were taking, for texturing 3D models that we would make from the volumetric captures that we did with the LiDAR scanners. So we had a whole pipeline going, and we were just running all of this stuff through and really giving it the hero treatment to get the best digital artifacts out of it that we could. And that's me with Tyrion Lannister's dagger. And this was like, we had like photos, reference photos of things that we wanted from the prop department to scan and to shoot. So this just shows kind of like the workflow that we went through with, you know, getting the item. This is on a small laser scanner with a turntable. And then you end up with a rough digital model out of that. That later will be cleaned up, fixed, and then they'll apply the photogrammetry textures to it. You know, this was a skull of a dragon that's found in the basement of Winterfell being scanned. And this guy here on the left, that's Tommy Dunn. He's the armorer of Game of Thrones. So he's the guy that runs the team, that ran the team, that made all of the swords, all the helmets, all the weapons. And he basically, we had the keys to the kingdom. Everything that they made, we had at our disposal. Amazing craftsman. He also had like 4 versions of every sword, because depending on what the action was supposed to be, you can't put an actor out there with a real steel sword. Never it's got a sharp edge, but even with a steel one, you don't want what happened to Alec Baldwin to happen, you know, on a set. So there's like rubber ones, there's wood ones, and then there's hero ones. The hero ones are for close shots. and those are the, with the real hand-pounded steel. And these guys made the swords the same way as people made swords in the Middle Ages, with hammers and blacksmithing. Anyway, this is a Tyrion Lannister's armor, and we even had Tyrion Lannister's little person body double for Peter Dinklage, the actor. He was still available, and he was happy to come in and wear the suit, the costume. And what were the results of all this? It was massively successful. It was insanely successful, globally successful. We could not have put up enough content for that show. Obviously, this isn't the kind of approach you do for a show that is, three people sitting around a kitchen table talking about their relationship. This is really only meant for something like this, which was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where it was a super high priority for an HBO to do this. Since HBO was a subscription service, we're not ad-supported. That was such a beautiful thing because we weren't beholden to how many ad impressions did it get to make money. It didn't have to make money. The money was taken care of by the subscription, right? Our role and our mission was to just make it great and make it great for the show, make it great for HBO. HBO has always been very, 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 they're master marketers, some of the best in the world, and they're very proud of that, and they won tons of awards. HBO would win 30 Emmy Awards. And what's interesting also in all of this is, while all of this was going on, Netflix was coming onto the scene, and their business drivers took them from, the DVD by mail business and the recommendation engine on the website that got you to pick your next DVD in the mail, and they invented streaming. That changed the entire business for everybody, for HBO as well. Another form of digital disruption. And that's a whole other conversation about how that affected the entertainment companies. That was a part of disruption that has actually been bad for their business models. Great for Netflix's business model because they invented it. But what's interesting is that once Netflix decided, hey, we're going to make our own TV shows and not just show reruns of network television shows and show other documentaries and shows. We're going to create a thin layer, of cream at the top that is going to be prestige television, and we're going to spend all this money to make that we make it from all the other stuff, and we're going to put it into production. What kind of shows did they make? They made HBO shows. And they just did it. They just opened the bottle cap and just did it. So it's interesting, there's like all of the innovation and all the technical disruption and all the changes that caused HBO to create that category of television, that was just adopted instantly by a very potent competitor who had invented a new mode of distribution, streaming, and said, we're going to make the same kind of shows you do. And they did. Started with House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, and they've kept going. And, that's a horse race that's still very much in progress. But net, all of this was very successful. So I would give it off to the Q&A, but first I would like to say, gracias. And that is in my living room.
I'm gonna check the
Oh, I gotta get the.
channel.
Hmm? Oh, it's here.
Yeah.
Because my Spanish is like a small child.
Yeah. So you can understand the question, you know.
Yeah. Perfect.
So you have to put
Yeah.
perfecto. That's it.
Do you have? I can do English and bad Spanish.
Yeah. No,
There's no setting for the bad Spanish. I don't want to disrespect the language.
then if you want to, you can just raise the volume.
Okay,
the
cool.
volume is full.
Awesome.
Right now.
I'm old, so I need that.
So
Thank you. Thank you. I can indeed. Oh, woo! Yeah.
Is that on? Yeah, now it's on. What would you do different now versus 10 or 15 years ago when you started this whole thing with Game of Thrones? Like, what are you doing different now, for example, with House of Dragon?
That's a great question. I probably would have been more like more selling of it in the organization, if that makes sense. And that is like that all pertains to like the political aspect of the way that corporations and media companies do business. There's like turf battles in companies like that, like the fact that we did that digital asset capture ourselves, and we didn't work with creative services, who were the people who do the on-air stuff, who were brilliant and great producers, and they were also in our marketing group. They were our colleagues. They had a monopoly on all the content that was created for marketing from the set and for all the on-air promos and stuff. And it was like the old, when I got to HBO, and I started building up HBO.com, and I had, the filmmaker background, the filmmaker skills as they did. Sometimes it was like a little bit like West Side Story, the Sharks and the Jets. So it was how do I be a good partner to them and they be a good partner to us, and get them to kind of like not get so defensive when we went out and actually did content capture in the digital space, which was not their thing, right? Like they didn't do that anyway. So it's stuff like that. I think probably also we probably should have worked harder at the web design piece of it, but that was a kind of, we started, Game of Thrones went on the air in 2011. So anyway, we got 2 Emmy Award nominations for seasons 2 and 3 for this Viewer's Guide. We won the Primetime Emmy Award in season 4. And then corporate cataclysm, bad changes of regime, etc. I left HBO at the end of 2014 with an Emmy Award in my hand, but after 7 years, that happens too. That's the business, If that makes any sense.
Hi. First of all, English.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Great content. This is a two-part question. First, I want to know how do you feel about the intervention of TikTok and social media, actual social media,
Yeah.
in distribution, advertisement, and how the media, the TV shows, the movies are adapting to distribution and advertising in video games. We have the case of John Wick, Deadpool, who not only create
Fortnite.
Yes, Fortnite. That's
Yeah.
the example that I was going.
Great question, and like that's a giant one. That's also rolls up to digital transformation and disruption. In all things, in the way that the marketing and content and marketing have evolved and media have evolved, it's kind of a cliche to say, we live in an information economy. We have a attention economy, right? And so it's an endless quest of advertisers and marketers in particular to create a message that cuts through, right? And there's just a huge amount of noise. We're all besieged by it. How many hours a day can you look at a screen? How many hours a day can you have media that you're not even trying to access being beamed at your face, or you're seeing it? With TikTok, everybody has like a media diet, basically. Like, what's the components of your diet? And that has changed, and it changes demographically, younger generations gravitating to social media, and then older people gravitating to social media. It started with like Facebook, and Facebook starts taking away all this mind share from television. It's a challenge because for those television and movie markets, media markets that depend on eyeballs, viewers, advertisers, less people watch, less money you make, etc. So TikTok is super, super, super interesting because how many hours are kids looking at TikTok? How many hours globally? It's insane. 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day, who knows, maybe more. I think there's some kids in their rooms in Japan that don't come out for years on end. The parents eventually have to have an intervention, say, maybe you should go out and take a walk in the park and maybe meet a nice significant other. People are glued to their screens for huge amounts of time. TikTok is eating everybody's lunch, basically. It's great for TikTok. But the interesting thing is, too, TikTok's day will come. TikTok will be replaced. TikTok will go out of fashion. There will be another one. Just as, Facebook was eroded by TikTok. And it's going to happen to TikTok, too. TikTok's also really interesting, though, because it's interesting to see the creativity that people come up with within the constraints of its form and its format, the way that it works. That's the brilliant thing, right? That's the addictive part. And the fact people could do these cool dance moves to begin with that looped. That's genius, right? But it poses huge problems. Do you know how much, by the end of Game of Thrones, do you know how much an episode of Game of Thrones cost for HBO to make? Estimated $15 million an episode. So they were spending over $100 million a year making it by the end, not in the beginning. But how do you do that if the audience's expectation is they want to have programming at that level, right? That's that resource intensive. How do you do that when kids are watching TikTok and don't even care that there is something on TV called Game of Thrones or anything for that matter? Interesting times. But I'll say this too. Part of the positive side of the digital disruption that represents, meanwhile, it's creating a creator's economy, which is, this is the gatekeeper's economy, right? movie studios, TV networks, book publishers, record companies, music labels. That's the gatekeeper's economy. They have to give you permission to play and to get your work out in front of people and to make money. The creator's economy, YouTube, TikTok, it isn't. It's, but it's a different game, right? So you might be able to do more authentic work at a lower scale but you'll be doing it on your own terms, but you'll have to build that audience. It's an interesting balance. Where there are challenges, there's opportunity.
Hi, how do you think we could extrapolate this idea to the whole industry to reduce the use of piracy? Because it obviously puts another barrier to it, right?
How do you mean a barrier to piracy?
Because the whole map and all the extras that the site had, I think it's a lot harder to replicate than just to record and then re-upload it.
It is. So I mean, you're talking about like what is any kind of competitive advantage for a media company or a TV company to do something like this. I agree with you. I think that there are things about it. I'm biased, of course. Now, almost nobody's doing this now. It's reverted to the old system where basically marketing is, nobody ever got fired for cutting and pasting stuff from the advertisements and the promos and sending them out on Facebook on time, right? You don't win Emmy Awards for that, but you're not going to get fired for that. And most companies don't want to invest in giving the audience extras. I think it might come back now, though, because we're now in a time where the streaming services are retrenching. The inheritors of my old HBO that I worked for, Warner Discovery, just today wrote off the books, wrote down $9.1 billion of value from the TV operations that they have inherited, which includes HBO. So, a lot of that has to do with they haven't been able to make the kind of money with the streaming, their approach to how they tackled streaming as Netflix does. But that brings an interesting question. What might you, if you want to make fewer shows and cut down on the crazy peak number of shows that are being made, maybe a good idea would be to give the audience more with the fewer shows that you make to create deeper engagement like we did with this. It's a question,
And how do you think this could affect long-term to the mindful consumption of media?
How this is a museum piece now. It's also, by the way, if you went to the URL, it's not online. 2 changes of regime later, they took it down. They didn't want to maintain it anymore. So I think, I don't even know if you can get to it with the Wayback Machine either. It's an interesting question. I mean, I tend to, it's my bias, but I tend to believe that I think fans and people who really love, narrative entertainment, I think that they would be interested and do like learning more about it. And I think that maybe if you watch less stuff but kind of go deeper into it, that might set up a healthier, screen time relationship with your brain. I don't know. It's a great question, though.
Hi. Kind of a quick question. As we know, fans are basically one of the most important things at the time of doing the series, because, of course, the content is made for them. So I got curious in the part when you mentioned the fanfics made by the fans.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to ask, have you ever saw the discussions or the fanfics that the fans were making, and at some point say, maybe we could use some of this?
Yeah, that was, that question came up a few times along the way. That's a very different approach to marketing. It's much more like democratized, right? You crowdsource it, which is a really interesting idea. I don't think it's ever really been tried at scale. That's a different approach. The problem with that, from the model that we had to work under at HBO, is again going back to the approvals process with the showrunners and the executives, the other programming executives. You have to. The fact is, there's the authorized HBO version of it, right? And that's the one that gets approved. And that's the one that has to be blessed by the show creators. Sometimes they're interested in what fans are doing on their own. And sometimes you do contests or marketing, activations where you could have people, frame it that way and say, oh, hey, send us your 50 pictures of your favorite Game of Thrones character and we'll give you a car or something, the way they always do that kind of stuff. You could do that. It's a very different approach, but using it in the official marketing, freestanding and saying you're going to basically just crowdsource, the marketing presence for the show, that wouldn't fly in a traditional broadcasting outfit. You know what I mean? Because of the approvals. But it's a really interesting idea. We also had numerous times we were approached by vendors who had cool technology that allowed people to do mashups and custom mashups of content from the shows and share it on social media, which were really cool. And we actually wanted to use it and release some of these to the public. We got a hard no from HBO on that, because the second that one of their stars that they're paying a lot of money to goes online and sees something that makes them look fat or stupid, all hell will break loose if we had anything to do with that. You know what I mean? It's complicated with talent relations. But we wanted to go a lot further than we were actually, our bosses were comfortable with. But that's a great question now. But I mean, that's basically what you're seeing now. It's what you're seeing in entertainment that largely lives on the web, and it is social. I mean, it's just have at it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.